Hello and welcome to podcast.init. We're recording today on May 14th, 2015. Your hosts as usual are Tobias Macy and Chris Patty. And don't forget, you can follow us on iTunes, Stitcher, or TuneIn Radio. And please give us feedback. Leave a review on iTunes or Stitcher. Contact us by Twitter. Send us an email at hosts@podcastinit.com or leave a comment in our show notes. Today we're interviewing Jacob Kaplan-Moss about his keynote at PyCon 2015. Jacob, could you please introduce yourself?
Yeah, hi, I'm Jacob. I helped create Django about 10 years ago. I founded the Django Software Foundation. Today, I'm the Director of Security at Heroku.
So, Jacob, how were you first introduced to Python?
Let's see. I was working for a data storage company. It was quite a while ago, maybe 15 years ago. I was an intern, and I was in the QA department there. And we had this massive test suite written in, well, the whole thing was written in Java, and for reasons I don't fully remember, it took ages to recompile and to rerun the test suite. And I remember taking like an hour and needing to go play. We would go play foosball while we waited for the test suite to recompile and rerun again. I got really good at foosball, not so good at Java, and I got really frustrated one afternoon with just how long it took to do anything, and I started casting around for a faster way. I had sort of this vague notion that there must be some sort of way that I could type code interactively and get a response back, and I stumbled across Python, the Java implementation of Python. The first thing that attracted to me was exactly that, was the REPL, being able to load up the compiled classes and interact with them dynamically and fool around there. And I got really inspired. I rewrote our test suite in Python over the course of just a couple of days. This was something that it had taken the QA staff maybe 6 months to write up all of these test suites, and mostly because of just how terrible and slow it was writing it in Java at the time. And I was able to rewrite it in Python in about 2 days, and ran faster. It was easier to contribute to. It was easier to maintain. Just kind of all around better. And I was pretty hooked from that moment forward.
Very cool. I have to admit that when I worked in Java quite a number of years ago at this point, that was always one of my big frustrations, was the fact that there is no REPL. I'm so used to learning languages by REPL, by playing with things, that it was a great frustration. So
yeah, for sure.
It's interesting.
It was weird because I don't have a formal background in CS, and I don't think I knew what a REPL was at the time. I'm trying to remember, but I think at that point the only languages I knew were C and Java, and I don't think I'd been exposed to anything with a REPL. But I had this notion that I just had this idea it didn't have to be this way. Like this was too clunky. There's no way that this is just how it's done. And I stumbled across Python, and later that I think learned that word REPL and the background and the history of that idea.
So we wanted to invite you on the show to discuss the keynote you gave at this year's PyCon. Can you tell us what you mean when you say that you're a mediocre programmer and why that's such an important admission to make?
Yeah, so there's this thing that happens when you get known for something like Django. Most people in the open source world who know me because of Django, and Django's been, successful beyond our wildest expectations. Today, 10 years after open sourcing it, it's quite good. And there's this assumption that people make that the reason that Django is so fantastic is because I'm this really badass programmer. And people always talk about, they always say things to me like, oh man, I can't even imagine making something as awesome as Django. You must be super great at what you do. And it's a weird feeling because I'm getting credit for something that I don't feel like I deserve. And this is different from imposter syndrome in that there are things that I am very good at, and there are things that I'm very proud of, and I can attribute some of the success of Django to some of those things, but it's not my programming ability. When it comes to just writing code, I'm at best average. I can do a fine job. I'm not bad. I'm not gonna screw up horribly, but I'm also not this exceptional developer that most people think I am. My skills lie elsewhere, and it was sort of that was the germ of the idea that led into this talk, is about the assumptions that people make about me based on these couple of data points they have and how incorrect they are, and casting about and talking to most of the other people that I know in the software industry, the majority of us are not particularly exceptional when it comes to software skill. You can do a lot with a little bit of skill. And we have exceptional tooling and exceptional practices available to us that can really help people with average skills produce exceptional products. And that was really the idea that I was trying to reach for, is this idea that software development is a whole suite and range of skills, and that you don't have to be quote unquote ninja to be able to be, really valuable and to be able to do good work.
Absolutely. One of the things I really enjoyed about your talk was where you talked about how your strength was not in going really deep with something, but in understanding, having a really good all-around view, and also understanding lots of different things and how they fit together, and how that made you successful.
Yeah, I've always been kind of a dilettante when it comes to learning skills. I love to learn new things, but I don't particularly like to practice them very deeply. So as a consequence, I have a lot of basic exposure to a lot of things. I know a little bit about a lot of things.
Right. Yeah. Well, it's funny, in our industry, there used to actually be a title for that. It was called the generalist, but it's kind of fallen by the wayside, and everybody wants hyper specialists now. Although it's moving in the other direction again, so who knows?
Well, it seems like people want hyper specialists in all skill areas is the thing. They want people who are specialists at general skills, which is kind of an oxymoron and impossible to achieve.
Indeed.
Well, that's the thing, is when we talk about, when you see a job ad, saying that it's looking for a ninja programmer, and then you look at that company's product, and if it's a typical web app, there's at least a dozen things that you need to know, from HTML, CSS, JavaScript, to whatever back-end language, to the framework, to SQL or other data stores, operations skills. There's this entire suite of skills there, and this idea that one person is going to be exceptionally good at all of them is just a pipe dream. I don't know anybody like that.
Yeah, exactly. Also, going back to what you were saying earlier about people saying to you that, I can't imagine building something like Django, is another misconception people have, thinking that they need to be able to create this magnificent piece of software fully formed at the first go, rather than really approaching it in the way that it always is, in being an iterative building of things over time. You have to start with a core kernel of functionality, just add to it over time, until eventually you get to something the scale and capability level of Django. So it's just another misconception that we have in our industry.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at Django's contribution data, there's something around 1,000 people who have contributed something to Django. And I'm nowhere close to in the top 10 on that list. I might be in the top 10, but barely. And yet we tend to credit that to one person. We have this idea really deeply embedded into sort of our psyche about this sort of genius inventor, and it doesn't mesh with the collaborative way that software, both open source and commercial, is produced these days. But we tend to still believe it. We're much more invested in the sort of Steve Jobs, Elon Musk, billionaire, brilliant inventor myth than we are with the idea of someone with a spare couple of minutes fixing a typo and multiplying that effort across thousands of people.
It's really interesting that you say that, because I think that myth is equally mythic in other areas as well, right? I mean, like you mentioned Steve Jobs or Elon Musk, I forget who it was who said we build upon the backs of giants. I mean, each one of those inventors, I mean, even Albert Einstein or Thomas Edison, they built on generations of scientists or whatever field they were working in before them, who paved the way for them to make these great discoveries. And I feel like software is exactly the same way, right? Like, I mean, even if you really are the lone hacker working till 2 o'clock in the morning in your garage creating something amazing. You're using tools that were created by other people who, you're leading on this ecosystem that was created by a cast of thousands, probably.
Exactly.
So what are some of the ways we can change the tone of the conversation around programming skill?
I was talking about this with a colleague of mine at Heroku, Chris Stolt, who runs our support team. And he was talking about, he made a really good point, which was that one way we can get at this is by changing the types of stories that we tell. So we tell these stories about Steve Jobs, about Linus Torvalds, about the genius, the lone wolf. We tell these stories about individual success, and we can change that narrative. We can start telling stories about collaborative success, about a group of people gathered together, coming together as a team and producing something great, sort of out of that collective skill and that sense of collaboration, and we can celebrate those types of successes, those sort of quiet, steady improvement over a long period by a large group, and sort of celebrate the work that it takes to keep a group of people executing. And I think I'm thinking about that a lot. I think that starting to tell those types of stories more can really help make our community feel more engaging and more welcoming, because it sends a message, not that you have to be brilliant and a lone wolf, but that you can, you need to figure out how to fit into a team and be part of a group. And I think that there's something really powerful about this concept of being part of a team. I mean, we have this hunger for sports as a culture, and we watching these team sports and thinking about this idea of the whole as more than the sum of its parts. And I think we can apply those kinds of narratives to the stories we tell about software. I think we can start to get to a healthier place.
Where does the myth of exceptional versus terrible programmers come from, and can you provide some examples of times you came in contact with this narrative?
Yeah, where does it come from is a difficult question. I think there's a lot bound up in it. I think one aspect comes from there's a running narrative in American culture about this sort of this myth of American exceptionalism. Pulling yourself up by your bootstraps. Anybody can do anything if you just work hard enough. It's kind of this Protestant work ethic that's embedded in our culture. Jung might call it the collective unconscious, a myth that sort of is embedded and really, really deep in our culture. And that intersects in dangerous ways with software, because we are so terrible at measuring our work when it comes to software. I mean, I mentioned this in my keynote. Like, what metrics do we have when we say someone's a good programmer? Like, what are we measuring? Are we measuring lines of code written? I mean, we know that that's a terrible metric for productivity. A line of code is neither good nor bad. Are we measuring, story points? What's a story point? How do you, can you collaborate or can you correlate from one project to another, or even from one day to another? Like, how are we measuring, when we say someone's really good, are we measuring that? I don't think we're measuring anything at all. I think we're just sort of, we have this, like, we're just sort of making these assumptions and making up these stories about people, but we really have no way of actually measuring what good is. And so we have this one idea of these geniuses that we think they're more common than they are because of these sort of root myths in our culture, and then we don't have any tools to measure anyone's performance, and so we just sort of try to fit them to a narrative. We stereotype, and either they fit into this idea of the genius or they don't, and so we assume if they're not a genius, they must be the other thing. They must be the idiot, and we don't have a complex way of thinking about skill in software. So that's where I think it comes from, although there's probably a lot more going on there. Times when I've run into it. Think about that for a second. Well, you certainly see it in recruiting and in hiring. I mean, I tend to focus in on that, words like ninja and rock star, because I think they're just so silly to apply to what we do. I mean, we sit in front of a computer all day and click at a keyboard. It's very different from what a rock star does. And but yet we put these things in our job ads, and they tend to be really off-putting people who are newer in the industry or don't match the stereotype of what a quote unquote ninja programmer is supposed to look like or dress like or act like, and it tends to keep those people from even thinking that they might be qualified for that job.
The whole gestalt around hiring in our industry is so strange. Speaking about that, when you look at the requirements that the average job lists, and they're like 10 years experience in Ruby on Rails, it's like Ruby on Rails hasn't been around for 10 years, so it's a physical impossibility for someone to have 10 years experience, but it speaks to that kind of like, they don't just want you to know something. They want you to be an absolute subject expert on everything out of box. It's kind of crazy, and I think it's really daunting for newcomers.
Yeah, I mean, we are just terrible at hiring, and I include myself in that. I'm a hiring manager at who I've hired a number of people, and nothing freaks me out more than trying to hire. It's, again, we have no tools to measure what we do, and so we are just bound up in our own biases and making this decision in a very non-scientific and very rough way. I think we do it about as well as anyone can at Heroku. I think we've got some checks and balances in place to try to make sure that we aren't hiring on the basis of bias and quote unquote gut feel. But man, it's super tough, and as an industry we are so immature when it comes to how we think of skill that it's amazing that we are able to make good hires ever at all.
Indeed.
Or actually, now that I've said that, I want to take that back. I think I'm wrong about that. I think the fact that most people are kind of average at things is actually what's saving us there, because we think that we're hiring for exceptionalism, but what we get is average because most people are average, and that actually turns out okay. So we're saved by the fact that even though we miss the mark on hiring exceptional people, we get people who are fine at their jobs, and they do fine, and they're able to contribute in just a fine way. So our own lack of understanding, it's not a surprise that hiring usually turns out all right, but we are missing the mark if we're actually quote unquote trying to hire A players all the time.
Right. It's really interesting that this comes up, because I don't know if you've ever listened to Saron Yitvarek's podcast, the Code Newbie podcast, but it's all oriented towards helping people get their first job in the industry, learn how to program, et cetera, et cetera. And one of the things she keeps going back to is, don't be daunted by ridiculous job requirements, like actually talk to people, actually get a sense of what will the job be like to do, what kind of work would they actually expect you to perform day to day in this job, and don't get scared away by these, 20 years experience, programming particle accelerators at CERN. It's almost meaningless.
Yeah, I struggle with this when I write job postings, because on the one hand, I want to sort of make a laundry list and put sort of all the things that I think might be intriguing and might make me want to interview a candidate. But then when I step back at the end and I look at the list of things, it's like, there's no way that any one person knows all of these things. So, I've started doing things like saying, hey, if you know at least 70% of this stuff, you should go ahead and apply. Or you should know some of these things and be excited to learn the rest. That's another one that I've used to sort of say, like, hey, this is a wish list, not a hard set of hard and fast requirements. Like, if you kind of match this, we should. And hopefully that balances those things. But yeah, like, we tend to we write these job ads like we're dreaming about some mythical person who's going to be able to do everything all at once, and we're never actually going to find that person.
Yeah. And one thing that I've seen a few articles recently about that's an attempt to address some of that is having more of a trial period. So basically having a project-based interview cycle. So rather than having somebody come in and do the entire interview all in one day, they say, okay, here's some material, here's some information about the kind of stuff we're doing. Why don't you work with us a little bit on this one small little project so we can see how you work and the kind of things that you actually know, when you're really working on something, and then we'll use that as our basis to determine if we want to actually bring you on full time. And that's sort of going back to the old apprenticeship mindset that we have in recent years moved away from. And I think that's to a degree detrimental to our industry and a number of other industries as well. But there's definitely been a little bit of a renaissance around that idea.
Yeah, and that's similar to what we do at Heroku. We do what we call a starter project, which is a sort of couple-day, intensive working together project, try to, simulate what it's like to actually be colleagues. The problem is, and I think that works better than the adversarial interview process, but it's still problematic that, it requires that the candidate have the ability to take a couple days a week off from their normal work and do what's usually an unpaid engagement on the basis of maybe getting a job. And there's a lot of privilege bound up in there. You need to be financially stable enough to be able to take some time off from your current job. You need to have a current job that won't fire you for missing a couple days. I mean, back when before I was lucky enough to work in software, I definitely had jobs that if, I was an hour late, I'd get fired, let alone taking a couple of days off. And so the apprenticeship style interviews certainly help with kind of bias, but they also introduce another one. This stuff is hard and it's complex.
Very good points. Thank you for bringing those up.
I will say, though, that I very enthusiastically recommend this kind of approach because I just went through a job transition 5 or 6 months ago now. I mean, it might be a little more, but in any case, one of the companies that I was interviewing with did that, and I thought it was so incredibly beneficial. They ended up not choosing to make me an offer, but because of that apprenticeship program, I ended up realizing that was the right thing for me as well as for them, and I felt like, as opposed to this crazy hiring process of, you go through the interviews and then it's like this black box and either you hear back or you don't and you're always wondering, well, exactly what happened. I feel like with the project-based approach, it's like, well, what happened. You're like, you know what I mean? Like, my skills were measured accurately based on what I did, and I felt like it was as educational and as satisfying for me as it was for them. So I really like that approach.
Yeah, I think, like I said, it's what I use, it's what we use at Heroku, so I can't be too critical of it because I do it, but I do think it's important to recognize the imbalance there and the fact that it's just may not be possible for certain types of candidates. I try to
absolutely.
I try to explain it to candidates as an option and say, if you can't make this work, we'll do something else. But even there's kind of a power imbalance, right? Because I have the job, they need the job. So I'm definitely sitting in the power seat when I'm having those kinds of discussions. And so it's difficult. We have to. These are the types of things I think we need to be thinking about and be really conscious of. The essential question when it comes to hiring is, is the interview process, whatever that looks like, what is it measuring? Is it measuring your ability to deliver at the job, or is it just measuring your ability to get through the interview process? Because if we do it wrong, it's going to end up being something like the SAT test, which is utterly not predictive of performance in college, performance after college. The only thing that the SAT predicts is your performance on future SAT tests. And so if our hiring process is measuring the wrong things, we're going to end up hiring people based on their ability to interview, not based on their ability to actually, contribute and be part of the team. And all of these types of biases that we introduce into those processes run the risk of selecting for the wrong criteria. Let me give you an example. When one of the things that we do at the end of the starter project at Heroku is some sort of like a, well, we used to call it a presentation. We used to have candidates sort of, give a presentation on what they worked at, and over time, as Heroku grew, the number of people who would come to these presentations got bigger and bigger, and at a certain point, there were, a few dozen people like coming to a presentation of this candidate's project, and suddenly we realized that, wait a minute, like we're now starting to select on the basis of someone's public speaking ability, which for almost all of our job roles is somewhat irrelevant. Like, how often in your programming job do you have to get up in front of 20, 30, 40 people and give a really stressful presentation? Like, most of the time, if that's not something you're good at, something you enjoy, you just don't do it. And so we dropped the name presentation. We scaled it back really far. I call it a debrief now. And it's usually, it's a handful of people, half a dozen at most. And no slides, very, very informal, because again, like, what are we selecting for? Are we trying to hire people based on their ability to deliver a presentation? Maybe if there's some sort of developer evangelist, then that might be appropriate, but for the vast majority of the roles, that's a really inappropriate signal to be selecting for, and yet we were sort of unconsciously doing it because we weren't looking at what was happening to our process as it scaled. So I think these are the types of things we have to constantly be looking at and constantly be asking ourselves, what are we actually measuring here? What are we looking at?
So what are some ways that we can work toward eradicating the myth of the 10x programmer?
I wish I knew that. I think it's pernicious, and I think it's gonna stay with us for quite a long time, because it taps into something really deep, something we want to believe about the world, and bluntly, we want to believe it about ourselves. I think the people who are most attached to this idea of exceptionalism are people who want to believe that they are exceptional, or that they could be exceptional if they're not now. So I think we need to keep pushing back on it. We need to keep telling people that they are welcome, regardless of what their skill level is. We need to work towards a much more nuanced understanding of what skill means, and celebrate other types of skills, like project management is incredibly important to complex work, design, product management. There's so many things that go into delivering great software besides just writing the code. I think we need to work on celebrating those things as much as we celebrate the cranking out code aspects of our jobs.
Absolutely, and I think, even beyond what you're talking about as far as people's job functions, I think sometimes celebrating people's ability in terms of like their personality and the skills that personality embodies, right? Like, in my experience, there's always kind of one, I know this is a real oversimplification, but there's always one Zen guy on the team. The person who, it doesn't matter, the building could be burning down, there could be explosions happening, people screaming, and this guy is just calmly sort of walking along, like, okay, let's get to the exit, everything's fine. And having that kind of person around can be such a benefit.
Yeah, all the studies on diverse teams show that diverse teams outperform homogeneous ones, and a lot of that comes down to different mindsets, different backgrounds, a different set of tools that people bring to the table, and yeah, that difference in mindset, that calmness is incredibly important. I think about that a lot, working for essentially an operations company, right? Like, being calm during a crisis is pretty critical skill when you work for, a company that operates a cloud as big as the ones we do. But I think most companies would be suited by that type of calmness. Everyone faces a crisis at some point.
Absolutely.
So yeah, definitely sort of selecting for a wide range of backgrounds and a wide range of skills helps us be prepared for the events that we can't predict.
So following on from the last question in our last discussion here, thinking about our industry's problems retaining women and other undervalued groups, do you think that the way many managers do performance reviews play a role? And if so, how can we do better?
I think performance reviews are pretty awful, at least the way that they're normally practiced. This idea of the yearly performance review, man, if you're talking with your manager if you're only talking with your manager about performance once a year, something is seriously wrong. I mean, that needs to be a regular session, something that happens continually and all the time. You should never be surprised by a performance review. In terms of how it impacts women, I'm definitely not an expert there. I would point to I just read a really fantastic book called What Works for Women at Work, and it really goes into a lot of the biases and struggles that women in particular face at work, and talks about strategies that women can use to sort of work against those problems. And I found it incredibly good reading, as someone who tries to be supportive of women in tech. It helps me to understand, the challenges that they face and to see the types of patterns that I may never be able to see directly and firsthand as a man, but that are things that, are very real. I suspect that performance reviews play into that retention in some way because they're super busted, but I don't know specifically.
Well, I think part of what I was thinking of is exactly what you just said when asking the question, in terms of a common sort of anti-pattern that I see is exactly what you just said, the yearly performance review, where you don't hear anything, and all of a sudden your review comes, dropping down at you like a brick to the head, and you find out that your manager has not been happy with whatever might have happened during the course of the year that you heard virtually nothing about. And I can only imagine that leads to unhappy people.
Yeah, one of the patterns that the authors talk about in What Works for Women at Work is what they call the prove it again pattern, where women and other marginalized people in our industry need to repeatedly prove their own worth in a way that men don't. A man who is successful once, sort of that success tends to be remembered, whereas women need to sort of continually prove their own worth. And I suspect if you're only having a performance review once a year, it's very easy for each review to be, a struggle to prove success. Whereas if you have more regular cadence of recognizing success, it's easier for someone to overcome that pattern of needing to, prove their success over and over again if they have a repeated opportunity to point, this is what I did well this week, this is what I did well this week, this is what I did well this week, and kind of build on that narrative of success over a long period of time.
Can you tell us about some other ongoing narratives in the technology industry that you find equally as damaging as our misconceptions around skills and knowledge?
Well, one that I really hate is the way that we think about the sort of venture capital approach to forming businesses. We talk about, from the very beginning, we talk about an exit strategy. Like when we're at the stage of a startup and the only thing that exists is a pitch deck, we're already talking about exit strategy. Oh, I'm going to sell to Google. Oh, I'm going to get bought by Facebook. Oh, and it's all about take a bunch of cash, push really hard, burn out, and then maybe get bought. And sure, if that's successful, that can make you a ton of money. But man, is that really the only measure of success that we have? I really hope not. I would like to believe that businesses can be formed that grow slowly and make money over the long term and provide a healthy work environment for employees and provide a product that people like and that is valuable to our world. And this sort of get rich quick scheme of venture capital really doesn't allow for those types of businesses. I'm really interested. There's new sort of investment firm called Indie.vc, which is all about trying to build these longer term sustainable businesses. And I'm really excited about that type of model of funding and investment, and I'm hoping that it catches on and is successful.
Yeah, I've definitely seen a number of instances where people have referred to smaller companies or one-person companies as a quote-unquote lifestyle business and using that as a derogatory term, where I personally view it as being a good indicator of personal success, because it means that somebody is able to be financially independent and do something that they're really interested in, rather than having to tie themselves to the goals of a corporation that they maybe philosophically disagree with.
I remember back during the first .com bubble, hearing somebody talk about what they called the Sunday test, and they were trying to decide if they were going to invest. This is a VC talking about whether he was going to invest in a company, and he said he would swing by the company's offices on Sunday, and if the parking lot wasn't full, he wouldn't invest in the company. And when I was 19. I think it was around when I heard that, my thought was, yeah, of course, like, we should really just be working our asses off and struggling really hard to you have to try really hard, and maybe you make those millions of dollars, and maybe you don't, but it's worth the risk. Now that I'm in my 30s, it's like, yeah, I don't want to work on Sunday.
No.
I like my weekends. I like my evenings.
Absolutely. I mean, and that's a healthy attitude, right? Like, I was just thinking as you were saying that, cue all the current discussions in our field around, burnout and other mental health issues from people who work at 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Humans were not designed to deal with ongoing stress like that. We need breaks. We need the opportunity to give our brains a rest, or at least do something different. I mean, that is an unsupportable lifestyle. And I think the industry on the whole is starting to learn that. The whole startup culture is still kind of in this crazed, like, work is life mentality. But I think there are a lot of people in a lot of places, and not just those of us who are getting older, who are coming to realize that this is not the way to run a ship.
Yeah,
there was a great study on crunch mode, on sort of having people work very long schedules. I forget the details, but it was something on the order of one week of 60-hour week is more productive than a 40-hour week, and 2 is as well. But once you get past about 2 weeks of crunch mode, performance just drops off sharply, and over time, it drops below the 40-hour success rate. And so, what happens is if you're seriously, you've got a deadline in a couple of weeks and you need to go into crunch mode to meet the deadline, as a strategic decision, that can be healthy-ish. But as a long-term process, forcing people to work these incredibly long hours is actually less productive over a long period of time than working a more sustainable schedule. And that definitely matches my experience of, sure, a crunch now and again to meet a deadline is something that happens. As a business, we're often beholden to circumstances not entirely under our control, and yeah, sometimes you make a mistake and commit to a timeline that's a bit too aggressive. But as a regular thing, this idea that you should be working every waking minute, man, you're actually damaging yourself. You're damaging your business too. It's bad for business. You're actually delivering less over a long period of time than you would be if you were working a more sustainable schedule.
Yeah, and going back to your keynote as well, you mentioned not just working for your primary occupation, but also working in your evenings and weekends to contribute to open source projects and continually be learning new frameworks and new methodologies, and always feeling like you're falling behind if you're not constantly working on something is another thing that really drastically contributes to burnout. And I've definitely, found myself susceptible to this notion as well, that if I'm not constantly reading another book about a, new way to build APIs or something, then I'm wasting my time, because, otherwise I'm going to end up falling behind and not be as marketable in 5 years if I'm not constantly on edge.
Yeah.
Tobias, why don't you take it away with the picks?
Sure. So my first pick is relevant to our conversation today. It's a website and platform called True Ability, and it is a different way of going about trying to apply for jobs. So rather than sending your resume into a black hole and hoping that you get a call back, it's more focused towards operations folks, but what they do is they give you a pre-built virtual environment. So they give you a virtual machine, has some particular problem with it or some particular thing that you need to do. They give you the list of things that they want done, and then they record your entire SSH session on that virtual machine. And then once you're completed with that, that gets sent to the hiring manager of the company that posted that particular job opportunity. And then rather than basing their decision of whether or not they want to continue the conversation on just what marks you happen to have on your resume, they can see how you actually performed and behaved in a pseudo-real environment. So that's my first pick. My next pick is Manjaro Linux. It is a Linux distribution that's based off of Arch, but it adds a lot of extra polish on top of it. So they have a graphical installer and just a really good default setup to make it easier to get started in the Arch world. They also maintain their own package repos so that they can ensure a little bit more stability than the default Arch repos, but you still have full access to the Arch user repositories and all of that. It's still a rolling release, so I've been greatly enjoying using that as my primary Linux distribution. My third pick is a company called Vulture, Vultr. And in a lot of ways, they're very similar to DigitalOcean in that they provide VPS, they're backed by SSDs, but they have a little bit different pricing model in terms of what you get for your money. And they also have a little bit more choice in terms of the types of images that you can spin up. So started playing around with that recently. Definitely worth a look if you're a fan of DigitalOcean, because their $5 plan actually gets you, I think, 3/4 of a gig of RAM and versus the 512 you get on DigitalOcean. So just another platform worth checking out. And my last pick is a board game called Mage Wars. And it's very interesting. I haven't had a full game yet, but I've played it a little bit. And you have a board, and you have a mage that you place on the board, and then you can summon different creatures and spells. And the whole object of the game is to try and beat the other mage on the board. You can it's by default a 2-player game, but if you get 2 sets, you can actually make it a 4-player game. And just a lot of really interesting game mechanics to it. It has a little bit of a deck building aspect to it, like with Magic, but it doesn't have the same aspect of Magic where you always have to be buying new decks to be able to keep up with the current state of the world. You can just buy the core set and leave it at that, or you can get a couple of expansion sets if you really want to, and it just adds a lot of really interesting dimension to the game. So Chris, why don't you go ahead?
I'm going to kick it off with a beer pick, because I like beer. This last weekend, we had some friends up, and he brought a bottle of K's for Creek from Brooklyn Brewery. And it's a style of beer that I had never had before called Creek. And it's basically a beer that has had fruit introduced to it during the brewing process. And this beer is really... It's dark, it's spicy and cinnamony, it's got like notes of citrus in it, it's really complex, really tasty. Everybody enjoyed it, even my wife, and a dark beer has to be good for her to like it. So definitely recommend that. The next thing I want to recommend is Trello, and I know a lot of people have probably already seen this, it's not new, but if you haven't seen it and you need to collaborate with a bunch of people on a complex task, and you need very simple task tracking that's like basically kind of effortless. You don't need something like a Jira or like a bug tracking system. You just need a cork board that you can track who's doing what when on. This thing, it nails it. It is super simple, super accessible, great for collaboration, and they even have a nice CLI for it. I really like it a lot. My last pick is another podcast called Dan Carlin's Hardcore History. If you're a history dabbler like myself, I can't consider myself to be an expert or even a real hardcore student of history. This podcast is really, really top-notch. He just finished a 6-part series on World War One called Blueprint for Armageddon, and it was just amazing. And even if you're not really interested in history, but you're interested in you follow current events, it is just amazing to me after having heard this series how much World War One, the echoes of that conflict still resonate to this very day in world politics and in all kinds of other ways. So, great podcast. If you like history, I heartily recommend it. Jacob, what kind of picks do you have for us?
Yeah, I got a few things. The first is a new book for people who want to learn Python and Django. It's called Hello Web App. It was written by Tracy Osborne, who herself taught herself to code about 4 or 5 years ago. And she's got kind of a design background, not a software background. And Hello Web App is written sort of specifically for non-programmers, people who want to be able to build their own sort of web product, their own startup without much or any programming background. There are a handful of Django tutorials out there. This is one of the best that I've seen. I really recommend it. It's very hands-on. It's very sort of actionable. It's extremely well written. I have a PDF. The physical book hasn't arrived yet, but it looks gorgeous. I'm looking forward to seeing the physical book as well. I think it's going to be really pretty, and this is probably going to be my go-to pick for people who ask the best way to learn Django. I have a couple of picks about women in tech. The first I mentioned earlier in this podcast was What Works for Women at Work. I think this is a fabulous reading, both for women who want to know about the sort of the patterns that they're likely to face in tech and in other industries as well, and then also for men who want to be supportive and want to try to work on diversity in our industry. The other is a similar report about why women read tech, written by Sue Gardner, who works for Wikimedia and has been involved in women in tech in a long time. And she has pulled together an astounding amount of research. I think something on the order of 100 different studies about why women leave tech, and it's distilled it down into about a 30 or 40 page in progress Google Doc that she's published for people to read and take a look at, and it's pretty great. My last pick is a browser extension called Library Extension. There's a Firefox and a Chrome extension, and it adds on any Amazon page, it adds a little, any Amazon book page, it adds a little sidebar that tells you whether that book is available in your local library. And so when you are browsing to see if you want to buy a book, it will tell you if it's available in your library. There's even a button that you can click on it to reserve the book and then go pick it up at your library. And that is, as someone who likes to read and doesn't like to spend an obscene amount of money on books, I find Library Extension to be pretty awesome.
Great. Well, thank you very much for taking the time to speak with us today, Jacob. And for anybody who wants to follow you and the different kinds of things that you're up to, what would be the best way for them to do that?
Yeah, Twitter's the best way. I'm Jacobian, Jacobian on Twitter.
This has been fantastic, and sometime I would love to have you back on the show to talk about, obviously you can't reveal all the secrets, but I would love to talk to you about your work at Heroku with security and perhaps about Python and security in general.
I'd love to. Yeah, there are very few secrets, actually.
Excellent.
All right. Well, thank you again, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day.